it's my great pleasure to introduce Magdalena Bieniak, who I've come across especially to do with the magnificent edition of Stephen Langton, which she's been running. But I've also come to recognize that she's one of the very few people in the world who I think understands or comes as close to understanding as possible the very difficult thinker that she's going to be talking on, that's to say Gilbert of Poitiers. So let me hand over to her straight away. And as you see, she's sharing the screen and has a presentation. So thank you very much, Magda.
Thank you, John, very much. I hope I won't disappoint you, because actually it's quite difficult to pick up the pieces of the bits of information about matter from Gilbert's text. I'll try to do it. Gilbert's views on matter have already been approached by many scholars, and it's hardly surprising because Euler is one of the first principles of reality for Gilbert, alongside with matter, alongside with divine essence and forms. So it would be difficult to disregard it while discussing Gilbert's metaphysics. And still, what remains after analyzing Gilbert's text on matter are actually doubts and questions more than answers, rather than answers. To start with the most general problems, what is the role that matter plays in Gilbert's system? For me, it is unclear whether this role is truly important, or whether he speaks of matter only because his main sources, namely Boethius' Opuscula and Chalcidius' commentary on Timaeus, do so. Second, what does it actually mean that matter is one of the main principles of reality? And this question is relevant above all because some of Gilbert's important views seem to depart from his sources. And third, does Gilbert really believe that the forms of the created beings inhere in the prime matter? And to these general questions, I also add more specific ones. Yet to face them, it is first necessary to recall the basic ingredients of Gilbert's metaphysics. Now, following Chalcidius, Gilbert lists three primary causes: God's ousia, matter, Silva or Yle, and the eternal exemplars, namely the forms. Apart from these simple principles, all that exists is composed of two basic metaphysical principles: esse or quo est and quod est, to use Boethius' terminology. Now, Gilbert often uses other equivalent terms, namely subsistentia and subsistence. Subsistentia is a nature or form which inheres in the subsistence and makes it be what it is. For clarity, I will stick mainly to these two denominations: subsistentia for esse or inherent form, and the subsistent thing for quod est or subsistence. Another important ingredient of Gilbert's philosophy is the rule that everything that exists is singular. This means that any subsistentia of Plato, his humanity, for example, is numerically different, distinct from any other subsistentia, such as Cicero's humanity. Obviously, by the same token, Plato and Cicero are two numerically different singular subsistent entities. And I will not be speaking today about individuality, which is another, even more complex problem. Subsistent thing is composed of many subsistentia. Gilbert calls this process of aggregation of forms concretio. Although he is perhaps not entirely explicit on this very important point, I believe we should safely assume that the forms of any subsistent thing are ordered according to the Porphyrian tree. And the most general of forms is the generalissima subsistentia, which produces the substance. At the bottom of the hierarchy of the accidental forms are the accidental forms embedded in a subject that is already formed by the genera and species. Now, Gilbert carefully distinguishes between the process of aggregation of forms and the act of creation. Now, act of creation consists in impressing the first subsistentia in the subject. The subsistent things become something precisely by virtue of that subsistentia. To be created means to become something, and this leads to unavoidable question. What does the first generalissima subsistentia here? And John has put it in even more striking words, namely, what the quod est makes into the quod est cannot be the quod est itself. So what is it? I think it's a very central question, actually. And Gilbert's texts do not offer a clear answer to this. For this reason, another question has been raised. Does the subsistent thing consist in a mere aggregate of forms, or is it also something else? And now, one of the most significant passages quoted by many scholars seems to be inconsistent on this point. On the one hand, Gilbert says that every nature, except for the primary causes, inheres in something. This is true also of the most general nature of the first generalissima subsistentia. The first subsistentia inheres in the subsistent thing, just like the subsequent natures. On the other hand, in the same passage, Gilbert affirms explicitly that the first most general subsistentia is preceded only by the primary cause, so either by the divine ousia, or by the abstract ideas, or by Yle, by the prime matter. It seems that the first two principles can be excluded. The ideas or separate forms are never subject to other forms by definition, because nothing can inhere in a separate esse. By the same token, the divine ousia, which is absolutely simple, cannot be subject to anything. Thus, the problem boils down to the following query. Does the most general subsistence inhere in the prime matter? And the notion of the prime matter is obtained by stripping all the subsistentia from the bottom to the top of the Porphyrion tree. What remains has no quality and no active potency. Therefore, it would seem that the prime matter is a very good candidate for being the foundation in which the most general subsistentia inheres. Gilbert's commentaries offer some hints in this direction. For example, I would like to draw your attention to this puzzling passage, which I will not even try to read in this printed form, in this edited form. Instead, I will pretend that what we have here is not a continuous commentary, but a multi-layered structure of overlapping glosses. I will read only the main text without the glosses. The small caps mark Boethius's words. The green marks are the commented lemmas, and the light gray marks the lexical clarifications. So what we get is ad vero id quod est, accepta in se forma essendi, est atque materie formaque huius concursu, opifice illa forma consistit. Ut corpus eo quod ut esse, corporalitatem habet est corpus, et homo eo quod humanitat. So we get a lot of information from this passage, but among other things, what Gilbert says is that matter and form meet and constitute a subsistent thing. Let us examine this statement. The basic difficulty can be seen from the perspective of the Porphyrion tree. The most general subsistentia precedes the subdivision into corporeal and incorporeal beings. The form of corporeity inheres in a substrate that is already formed by the generalissima subsistentia. Accordingly, regardless of how one understands the nature of the substrate in which the form of corporating is, that substrate cannot be essentially different from the substrate of the incorporeal creatures. Thus, there seem to be only two viable solutions. Either the prime matter is the foundation of both corporeal and incorporeal creatures, or it is no foundation of the created beings at all. The first option amounts to a kind of universal hylomorphism. The second one amounts to, or at least is compatible with some kind of bundle theory. Now, both of them are quite explicitly contradicted by Gilbert, as can be seen from these quoted passages. And I can see only one of them. Oh, okay, it's appearing. The universal hylomorphism can be rejected because Gilbert states that incorporeal beings have no matter at all. In particular, they share no common matter with corporeal beings. The bundle theory is untenable for three reasons. First, every nature which is not a primary cause inheres in a subject. Second, only God is his ess. In all the creatures, both the spiritual and the corporeal ones, all the subsistentia, without exception, must be distinguished from the subsistent thing. Third, properly speaking, no subsistentia is subject to another subsistentia. So this is true even of God himself, okay, if we consider God a form. By extension, metonomice, a subsistentia can be said to inhere in another subsistentia. But this is only a matter of speaking derived from the fact that the generic subsistentia, for instance, enables the subject to receive specific and accidental subsistentia. So it causes the inherence of the species and of the accidents. Moreover, a form without matter, that is to say, a form which doesn't inhere in any subsistent thing, not only fails to be subject to any other forms, but cannot even be called subject or matter in the improper sense of the term. So, since both universal hylomorphism and bundle theory must be rejected, it seems to me that there is an aporia in Gilbert's metaphysics. Facing it requires reanalyzing the meaning of the basic notions used by Gilbert, in particular the notion of matter. The term materia has at least three significance, two proper and one improper. M1, the first and the basic meaning of materia is silva or yle, that is to say, the prime matter. Gilbert describes it as the foundation of every corporeal creature. The prime matter has neither quality nor any other form. It exists, but has no proper nature or active potency. It cannot be described and doesn't make anything be what it is. It has no quality and produces no effect. So this is the first proper significance of the term. Now Gilbert says that there's also a second proper significance of the term, and this time it refers to singular corporeal bodies. To be a body means to have the subsistentia of corporeity. In other words, what makes that body a body is its subsistentia of corporeity. Thus, the name body is derived from the form, not from matter. Nevertheless, given that body can be considered in relation to the subsequent subsistentia, such as animality or whiteness, any singular body is matter in the second sense. And finally, in the third, improper or derived sense, the term matter can be applied to any subsistentia that forms a composite substrate in which other subsistentia inhere. So metaphorically speaking, metonomice, any genus or species subject to other subsistentia can be called matter. For example, this animality is matter in the sense that it makes this single subject an animal, and thus enables it to receive the specific difference of a cow, for example. In its turn, this single cowness is matter in relation to the subsistentia of blackness, and so on. The term in the second sense can be applied only to corporeal beings, not to the incorporeal ones. Therefore, it cannot be the substrate of the generalissima subsistentia, which precedes corporeality and incorporeality. The third improper sense regards only the subsistentia, and so by definition, it cannot be applied to what precedes the first subsistentia. The prime matter is obtained precisely by stripping all the imaginable subsistentia, and accordingly, if the first most general subsistentia inheres in something, we should assume that the subject is the prime matter. But the problem is it even correct to affirm that the first most general subsistentia inheres in something? According to Gilbert, what remains after stripping all the subsistentia is nothing rather than something, because to be something means to have a nature or to produce an effect of some kind. And without the first subsistentia, there is no nature or effect. Gilbert makes a clear and explicit distinction between something and nothing. And matter is nothing rather than something. Yet the generalissima subsistentia of the spiritual beings is also embedded in a substrate. And if there is a basic substrate of the spiritual beings, it is also nothing, just like Yle. But if the ultimate foundation of the corporeal substances is nothing, and the foundation of the incorporeal substances is nothing, is there any reason to deny matter to spiritual substances? All this seems to lead to the unavoidable bundle theory. Unfortunately, as we have seen above, there are many reasons to deny this interpretation. Because to inhere means to be embedded in a subject. So we have arrived at the dead end. Given the aporia, let us take a closer look at the reverse of matter, the fons or subsistentia. The subsistentia has a double function. It makes the subject exist, and it makes it be what it is. Even the bare fact of existence depends on the first subsistentia that inheres in the subsistent being. When subsistentia starts to inhere in the subject comes to being, and when it goes away, the subject is destroyed. Thus, the subsistentia is a necessary cause of the subject's existence, and there is no such thing as a pure act of existence without any determination. The first and most general subsistentia makes its subject something, namely, it makes it a singular substance in the most general sense. In this way, the subject comes to existence and is ready to receive the subsequent, more specific subsistence. Now, the important aspect of this theory is that whatever the first subsistentia inheres in, that substrate doesn't exist until it becomes subject to the first subsistentia. It seems that the same can be said of the prime matter. Until matter is separate, it is nothing, because as such it has no nature nor active potency. But if the first more general subsistentia inheres in the prime matter, then matter is the foundation of both corporeal and incorporeal substances, and thus we arrive at the other dead end, because Gilbert denies any matter to the incorporeal beings. So let us leave the incorporeal substances aside, and for a moment let's focus on the bodies. According to Poitiers, All corporeal substances share the same matter. No such thing can be said of the incorporeal beings. Being material is therefore a distinctive feature of corporeal creatures. Gilbert comments on this passage and adds a very important clarification. The corporeal substances share the same matter in the sense that they have similar features, not in a numerical sense. Everything that exists is singular. Therefore, two separate substances share neither the same subsistentia nor numerically the same matter. According to Gilbert's interpretation, communis et eadem means that the numerically distinct bodies are similar because their subsistentia are similar. Or, to use Gilbert's terminology, they are naturally and causally identical, conformes. This similarity depends first of all on the generic subsistentia of corporeity, which follows the first most general subsistentia, and is prior to other material determinations, such as weight, extension, color, etc. And in accordance with the Porphyrion tree, the subsistentia of corporeity is co-responsible for the distinction between the corporeal and the incorporeal substances. Thus, the subject endowed with the subsistentia of corporeity becomes matter that the subsequent determination inhere in. It becomes matter in the second sense that we have seen above. Gilbert analyzes the metaphysical structure of the material beings by taking Boethius' example of a wooden bed. The nature of a bed is such that it always tends to move downwards, the orsum, unlike fire, which naturally tends to move upwards, sursum. Nature depends on subsistentia. Which subsistentia? The shape of a bed is an accident of a wooden substance. If we consider only these two forms, two subsistentia, being a bed and being wooden, the natural tendency to move downwards doesn't depend on the accidental artificial shape, namely on the form which makes bed a bed, but on the subsistentia which makes that bed wooden. Now, the form which makes that object wooden is labeled by Gilbert species or the specialis subsistentia. The species wood is a composed subsistentia. It has many properties, such as being solid and heavy. Some of these properties belong to the bed's genus, namely to the subsistentia of earth. The genus earth is a part of the species wood, in the sense that the part of the subsistentia which makes the bed wooden is numerically the same as the subsistentia which makes that bed earthen. In other words, some of the properties of wood are numerically the same as the properties of earth. To put it yet another way, the properties of earth are a proper subset of the properties of wood. The property of being heavy is one of these properties. Accordingly, the bed's tendency to move downwards depends on its generic subsistentia, earthiness. Now, the interesting point is that the singular derived subsistentia, earthiness, is an image of the separate pure idea of earth. Following Chalcidius, Gilbert affirms that the separate idea of the earth is not simple. It is a composite form consisting of the prime matter, Yle, and pure intelligible species. It is not composite in a different sense. It has no inferior forms that inhere in it, and it is not combined with any other substances. In other words, the ideal earth has no matter in the second sense. Nevertheless, earth has its own forms, the form of being dry and the form of being heavy. Importantly, the name earth is derived from these forms, not from the prime matter, which in itself is nothing. The dryness and weight of a singular bed are images of the properties of the pure ideal earth. These images inhere in matter, just as the pure forms of the ideal earth inhere in the prime matter. Since everything that exists is singular, the subsistentia of earth confers generic similarity on numerically distinct bodies. Thus, to be corporeal or material means to share some generic similarities, which depend on the subsistentia of corporeity and the subsistentia derived from the ideas of the four elements. How is this construction of the material bodies different from the metaphysical structure of the spiritual substances? Each spiritual substance, for example, a singular soul, has its own singular forms and accidents. These forms are subsistentia that inhere in a subsistence. And in this respect, spiritual beings are similar to the corporeal ones. However, the incorporeal and the corporeal substances have no common matter, no shared matter. This means, above all, one thing, that incorporeal and corporeal beings share no generic similarities apart from being substances. The subsistentia of the spiritual substances are no images of the eternal forms of the four elements. No weight, solidity, dryness, or other elementary forms can be attributed to any soul. To be spiritual means to have neither elementary properties nor other properties such as whiteness or geometric shape that require some elementary properties and corporeity to inhere in. The corporeal subsistentia make the corporeal substances be what they are. In other words, they make them material beings, since everything that is something due to its subsistentia. Hence, any material substance is material not only due to yle, but above all due to the subsistentia that make matter what it is, because in itself yle is nothing. Thus, the difference between the corporeal and the incorporeal beings depends on the subsistentia, not on the difference between yle and the basic substrate of the incorporeal beings, because whether we speak of yle or the hypothetic foundation of the incorporeal substances, we speak of nothing. It would be difficult to draw a distinction between nothing and nothing. So the difference results only from the inherent subsistentia. To be sure, the forms that make the subject a material being require yle, both in the separate exemplars and in the concrete singulars. However, the distinctiveness of the bare substrate of matter emerges only when the corporeal subsistentia arrive. I suspect, but I have no proof, that the metaphysical justification why Gilbert speaks of corporeity or materiality as opposed to spirituality is because the subsistentia that are characteristic of the corporeal beings are images of the material ideas, namely of earth, water, air, and fire. And these are material ideas in the sense that they are composed of yle and the intelligible species. And where do these material ideas exist? Are they composed intelligibilia in the eternal mind of God, just like Chalcidius suggests in his commentary? Or perhaps these pure substances exist only at the beginning of the creation, so that they are principles mostly in a diachronic sense? I find no answers to these questions in Gilbert's commentaries. So I will just briefly conclude, recapitulate what I've said, and I finish. What remains at the bottom of the subsistent things is a truly elusive substrate, which cannot be defined in any way. In particular, it doesn't make any sense in Gilbert to speak of corporeal and spiritual matter because to predicate corporeal or spiritual of something is already to add a formal determination. And in other words, any attempt to indicate a difference between Yle and the ultimate foundation of incorporeal beings would amount to granting these foundations with some forms, and this would go against the very notion of the first substrate. I doubt both universal hylomorphism and bundle theory. I would rather say that for Gilbert, matter somehow emerges from a particular aggregation of subsistentia. The subsistentia of the corporeal beings are images of the chalcidian material ideas, the pure eternal elements that are embedded in the prime matter. Are these material ideas the reason why the first substrate of the incorporeal creatures cannot be called matter? I don't know. The question remains open. Thank you very much.